This is Theory of Change. I'm Matthew Sheffield. Thanks for joining me for another episode. Before we get to today's program, I just wanted to mention that Theory of Change is part of the Flux Media Network, so go to flux.community for more podcasts and articles about politics, religion, media, and society. And you can also go to theoryofchange.show to get directly to the archives of this program. We've got the video, audio, and transcript of the episodes, and I appreciate everybody who is a paid subscriber. Thank you very much for your support. All right, so with that little plug out of the way, let's get into today's program. After she became the Democratic Party's standard bearer, Kamala Harris didn't make sweeping changes to the campaign infrastructure that she inherited from Joe Biden. But there is one critical difference between the two campaigns, and that is that Harris's team, and possibly the candidate herself, seems to have realized that the mainstream media is not her ally, and that news organizations that refuse to state the obvious truth that Donald Trump is a moronic authoritarian who is stage managed by people who hate American democracy are themselves not interested in protecting the country from him. The lesson that Harris appears to have learned has been one that Democrats should have learned decades ago. The Republican Party is not interested in serving the public, and its policies are about enriching the billionaire oligarchs who control its policymaking apparatus. But there is one group on the political left that learned this lesson a long time ago. That is the podcasters and writers who came on the scene in the mid-2000s as the liberal blogosphere. And my guest on today's episode, who goes by the pseudonym Driftglass, was one of the earliest left-wing bloggers. I personally was there in the beginning of right-wing blogging, so today I thought it would be fun for us to compare notes about how things went back then and how both the left and the right have responded to blogging since that time.
And joining me now is Driftglass. Welcome to Theory of Change.
Thank you for inviting me. It's an honor to be here.
Yeah, you are actually the first ever pseudonymous person I have had on the show. So
Well,
I don't know if that's an honor or what.
I have a face for radio, so, you know. Well, that actually is a relic of the old blogger days, you know, the real old blogger days, when I was a City of Chicago employee and commenting sort of on the down low at blogs. Might have been hitting on one of yours, I don't know. And you had to pick a handle, and I picked this one, and it sort of stuck with me. So.
Yeah, well, and that's actually, you gave us a perfect segue for the discussion here, which is, so both you and I started in the blog world in its very earliest days, and it still exists now. And but things are different in terms of how the left and the right use them. And so in my case, you know, I started in 2000 running ratherbiased.com, criticizing Dan Rather as a right-wing blogger.
Mm-hmm.
And, you know, after that happened, after he kind of, well, basically refused to, you know, acknowledge that his documents that he used were fake, and everyone knew they were fake, and it was obvious. You know, he lost his career at CBS because of that. And
He did.
And, you know, and everybody on the right, I think, eventually realized, oh, wow, there's a lot we can do with this stuff, right-wing organizations.
Yeah.
And I had an entire pretty big business built off of that, helping them do that. Whereas on the left, that is not how things kind of worked with the blogosphere. And you were there, so
I was.
Why don't we get started with that?
I was not there at the creation. I was there at day 6 of the creation, not day 1 of the creation. So I was a newbie. And I still think of myself as a junior varsity blogger, even though all the varsity members have gone on to greater and bigger things. I got involved in blogging. My wife started blogging in 2004. 2004 was the D-Day for most of us. It was the, oh my God, George Bush just got reelected. How the hell did this happen? And I started commenting in 2004. And then eventually I was a regular over at Steve Gilliard's blog, who was the first front page blogger that Daily Kos ever started featuring on Daily Kos. So he left to do his thing. I visited his place. He basically told me, you have to get out of the comment section. I'm sick of pulling your stuff up and posting it. Go get your own goddamn blog, and we'll link to you. So I did that. And that's how we got started. And it were heady days, because it really, for a while, looked like we were going to bend the curve on the legacy media, because there was, like, Ned Lamont. Ned Lamont was the blogosphere candidate that beat Joe Lieberman in a Democratic primary. And that looked like, holy crap. The first Netroots Nation I went to was the one just prior to the 2008 election. And every Democratic candidate, save one, was there, courting the bloggers. And there were like 200-something international press in attendance and so forth. So it looked heady. It looked like this was the direction we were going, because the media was so clearly broken and so clearly unable to cope with what was happening during the Bush administration and the collapse of the economy, and Katrina comes along. And the only people talking in plain, simple, blunt language with details, some of whom were really excellent writers, were the bloggers. But the reaction to Ned Lamont winning the Democratic primary against Joe Lieberman was a hysterical column in the New York Times by David Brooks, calling us the Tom DeLays of the left. And we were just the Sunni and the Shia. It was Tom DeLay, corrupt monster on the right, and the Netroots on the left, and we were a threat. And I have up on my tab up here somewhere, just because I was doing research today earlier, he was on the Hardball show with Chris Matthews, talking about how, you have the crazies on the right, and you have the Netroots crazies on the left, and the Netroots crazies are crazier. And they're all laughing and joking about how nuts the liberals are for saying things that turned out 2 years later to be absolutely true. And the thing that shocked us the most was all of the people who were shut those people down, shut them up, they're crazy, they're crackpots, they're nuts. All those people still have their jobs. And nothing ever happened to them. There was no market correction. There was no, gee, we really screwed up the Iraq war badly. We're sorry. I caught Mr. Brooks's act. I think I mentioned this last time we talked at the Hammerschmidt Auditorium in Evanston or Elmhurst, Illinois, in 2010. And a nice lady in the audience stood up and asked him about all the terrible columns he'd written about liberals and how monstrous we were and how he bashed us. And he just stood up there in the pulpit and said, "Never said that. Never, don't remember ever saying anything like that." And he just went gliding right on past it. He is still the premier conservative writer at the New York effing Times. So the thing we underestimated was how hard the legacy media would work to protect itself from reform, and how much effort they would put into legitimizing the right, because it was very important once you lost the left are all crazy doctrine. You had to find a new one, because clearly the George Bush administration was a catastrophe. There's no getting around that. So what's the next move? Well, the next move is, well, both sides are crazy. Both sides are bad. And it became this fetish, which became the state religion of the legacy media. And they're still doing it to this very day. You can watch the New York Times barbering what Donald Trump says, this incoherent gibberish coming out of his mouth that if you were there, you'd go, the guy's a lunatic. But if you read it in the Times, it's like, well, he has a policy proposal for childcare. And so there's this straight line where we just underestimated how tenaciously the legacy media would dig in and just refuse to reform itself. And that's where it all sort of fell apart. That's where it broke into pieces, because that's what we lost. It did remind me a little bit of the hippie movement in the 60s, which I did not go through. But once it turned out that, like, they were willing to shoot people on campus, and the Chicago cops were willing to crack heads in the streets, and they weren't going to reform, and they weren't going to change, and the Pentagon was not going to be lifted up by love, the movement fell apart because there was no plan B. And so a lot of legacy bloggers are still out there, but, we're still doing what we were doing, but we're watching the circle come all the way around, which is kind of interesting and exciting and depressing all at once.
Yeah. Well, and we'll. I definitely want to talk about the present moment later on for sure. Now, one factor also I think that happened was the rise to prominence and power of Howard Dean, but then after he got out as the DNC chair, I think that also probably was a big impact on you guys as well.
Yes,
right?
It was. He screamed that one time, then his candidacy was over. And although there was a
but his DNC candidacy was after that.
Oh yeah,
though, so
yeah.
He still had some juice after.
There was a lot of a lot of hope for the OFA, Obama for America.
Organizing.
Obama for America.
Organizing for America.
Exactly. That transition would take place, and there'd be this sort of infrastructure for, and that just sort of fizzled out and went away as the accommodations were trying to be made. And I think I have lots of thoughts about Barack Obama. He announced his presidency about 2 miles from where I'm sitting, or his run for office here in Springfield, and I supported him twice. But goddamn, that guy just never learned. He kept trying to pretend the Republican Party was something other than it really was. And it cost him dearly because he wasn't ready for what they were going to do to him. And he was on his back foot almost from day one.
Yeah, he was. And, and then beyond the sort of the party apparatus, it is interesting. To look at the way that let's say the larger media organizations exist on the left and the right, after blogging became a thing, that pretty much now, if you go to any right-wing website that's of any size, their articles are basically blogs. That's what they are. Whereas, number one, there isn't hardly any actual left-wing media.
True.
And committedly. There's, just as an example. So you've got the Daily Wire, you've got Daily Caller, you've got Heritage Foundation Daily Signal, you've got, of course, Fox News has a bunch of different properties, and then you've got all these other
Free Beacon.
Free Beacon, another one, and but then all these video platforms as well, like Real America's Voice, Newsmax. They just started another one called the First, which and then of course you got the Christian nationalists over at Salem Media with their Town Hall and Red State and Twitchy and Hot Air, and it is and then by comparison, there's Talking Points Memo, Mother Jones.
Well, I got to plug Crooks and Liars because my wife is an editor for Crooks and Liars, and they have the distinction of being the first video place on the web. Before anybody had embeddable video, they were doing video. So
before YouTube, and what's different though is that all these places that I mentioned, or Washington Monthly was another early blogging site, is that all of these were independently financed,
right?
And to the extent that there were other things that were maybe somewhat lefty sensibility, they were corporate owned. So the Daily Beast or the Vanity Fair or things like that. That their goal isn't to be progressive.
Right.
Their goal is to make money. And that's that. There's a paradox, because I think that the left media ecosystem is more capitalistic and more dog eat dog than the right wing media ecosystem, which operates hugely outside of. And I can say this, having been inside the right wing ecosystem. I was there. These guys are not capitalists. No. Your average right wing commentator, like Ben Shapiro or any of these other people, they don't know anything about history. They don't know anything about policy. They don't know anything about campaigning. They don't really know much of anything about anything. But what they do is they repeat the talking points.
Yes, they do.
And that's enough. And that's enough for him. Whereas on the left, I think that people who can, have the money on the left are they think that the general public just kind of will figure things out by themselves. They don't need to have everything broken down for them and drill the message into it. They don't think that. What do you think?
That is a common lament. I don't think that they talk to the public very much. The people who have money don't seem to understand. This was the reaction to let's dump Joe Biden. There were a lot of people on the left who got columns all of a sudden in the New York Times freaking out and just demanding that Joe Biden step down immediately. Aaron Sorkin got himself a column. And then George Clooney got himself a column. And they were just hysterical. And I don't think they're coming from a bad place, but they weren't listening to the base, who were like, he's our leader, he's the president, he will make up his mind, quit screaming and calm the fuck down, pardon my language. And then it was, well, we should do a speed dating thing or a convention thing. Like, no, it's Kamala Harris. That's the vice president. That's the person. And so there's all this.
Who people actually voted for.
Who people actually voted for and liked. And the people who were, getting themselves in the paper or getting themselves op-eds or getting themselves on television because they're celebrities or they're well known. I think Aaron Sorkin suggested that Mitt Romney be the vice presidential candidate or something like that. I mean, it was just. He was writing a West Wing, script in the New York Times, and we were laughing at him because the base didn't want any of that. And there is this weird parallel between the two sides in that the Republican Party lost itself because it didn't know what the base was. You get all these conservative elites now who are like never Trumpers and run the bulwark, who all swear to God they never had any idea how bad the base really was. And we knew. We were telling you. We were telling you for 20 years, but they didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to listen. And there's still this fantasy that somewhere there's a pony. That if we just keep digging through the crap, there'll be a diamond there somewhere. There's a hidden Republican Party way over there, and once Trump's gone, we'll recapture it. No.
The fever will break.
Yeah.
God, I'm so sick of that phrase.
The 10th year of the fever will break. And even before that, Barack Obama was talking this way during his presidency.
He was, yeah.
But he operates at their level of they don't talk to the base. I mean, they communicate with us, and we have votes, and we basically agree on policy. But the right elites claim to never have understood their own base. And Stuart Stevens is pretty honest about this when he says it was all a lie. All the stuff we said we believed in, turned out they didn't care about any of that stuff. The same is true in a less destructive way on the left. The people who were at the top and who were tastemakers and influencers had no idea the base didn't want to hear screaming freakouts over Joe Biden and didn't want to hear, let's get anybody in there but Kamala Harris. Let's find a way to sort of juice the system, and we'll have a speed dating or whatever the hell it was, and we'll have Oprah and Michelle Obama have a super fast convention, and they weren't listening to the base because they don't understand us. They don't come out in the middle of America and talk to actual voters. They don't know what we think. And I think there's this disconnect where if I get my op-ed in the New York Times, I will have talked to the people I need to talk to. And the answer is no. We think the New York Times is a joke. And so there's no need to spend money on a liberal media because they think they already have a liberal media. Whereas on the right, they
absolutely. Yeah. No, you're 100% right about that. They haven't understood that the mainstream media, while they are not, let's say, screaming reactionaries who want to burn the government to the ground, they're not that. Like, that's fair to say that they're not.
No, that's true.
But their business model is not to be a progressive advocacy organization. That's not their point. That's not how they see themselves, and that isn't how they conduct themselves, and they never have conducted themselves. Like Republicans, and in my former world of the right-wing media bias industry, they basically convinced. It's ironic. They convinced Democrats that the media was liberal.
Yeah, they convinced.
I think that's what happened.
They convinced, and there is something about, and this is something that I've talked about with my wife, and we've talked about with her dad, on Zoom. We have a regular Zoom date where we play the New York Times crossword puzzle every Thursday and Sunday, and he's 80-something, sharp as can be. But he is in his generation, to be a well-educated, well-rounded person, a learned adult person, meant you took the New York Times. That was part of your personality. It was wired into who you were. You crack the New York Times open, and that's how you know what's going on in the world. You watch PBS, you read the New York Times, you read what's on the book list, and the idea that the Times is just rotten when it comes to opinions and things is like heartbreaking to these people. They don't want to hear it. And I mean, I don't know if you saw this comment or this column yesterday. The Washington Post, A.G. Schulzberger, he had his column in the Washington Post yesterday. It was a very nice long column about the threats to free speech in India and Brazil and Turkey. And very well put. But there's a paragraph smack at the top going, but I'm not in the politics business. I'm not in the advocacy business, and I think it's basically ridiculous to suggest that we're at any kind of risk like these countries are. So I'm not in that business. I don't advocate for stuff. It threatens my status as the steward of an independent media company. Like, dude, you are living in a dream world. You're living in the 70s. You're living through your ancestors who ran that thing. And that's the problem, is because the conception of what an independent media means both sides.
Mhm.
Both sides are always the same. Journalism means both sides. And that even people who worked in the media, Mark Jacobs, who was a editor at the Chicago Sun-Times and Tribune, just is on Twitter X every day screaming, stop it. This is not, you're screwing up. Don't you understand what's going on here? And they don't understand.
Yeah.
So they have their own religion. And their religion dictates that if there are two candidates who are old and two candidates that seem a little bit infirm, it's okay to just bash the crap out of Joe Biden. Because age and infirmity are an issue. Joe Biden leaves the race, suddenly it's not an issue. Because I can't both sides it anymore, so it's not an issue anymore. And if Donald Trump spews a string of incoherent gibberish, we're going to write it up as a serious policy prescription and compare it to Kamala Harris's policy prescription, because that's fair. And if Donald Trump just lies all the time and Kamala Harris doesn't, we're just not going to talk about his lying. Because to do that would violate our dogma of it's always got to be both sides. Because if it's not both sides, if it's only one side, that means we've been wrong about everything since, let's see, 2004, a really long time. We've been screwing up for a really long time, and we're absolutely not going to look in that mirror. So that's what we're stuck with.
Yeah, and it's also that they have this institutional bias to think that, well, I'm above it all.
Exactly.
I am not a prisoner to partisanship. I'm beyond that. I'm my own thing. I exist in this savvy world of insiders, and I don't believe anyone. I'm just cynical, and it's like they haven't understood that cynicism is ultimately the best attitude for reactionary fascism.
And for totalitarians love cynics because they just give up.
They do.
And I don't know if were you reading my blog today? Because I wrote a whole thing about how fighting.
I didn't actually, but I'm glad you did.
No,
go for it. Great minds think alike.
I got up early and I wrote this thing that, A.G. Schulzberg I'm glad he finally admitted that he thinks that fighting for democracy is beneath him. It's just so dirty and grubby getting in there and fighting for democracy. We're above that. We're the New York Times. And we are eternal.
Yeah.
Presidents come and go, governments come and go, countries come and go, but the New York Times is eternal. Therefore, we don't need to worry ourselves about, which is the antithesis of getting in touch with the actual human beings in the world. They sent, when it was Donald Trump, man, they sent caravans of people to the middle of the country to do what I called magic ruralism, which is find that Ohio diner, find that Trump voter, because we are blown away these people exist. We never knew they existed. I mean, we haven't gotten past the Hudson in 40 years, so we didn't know any of this stuff. Cool. All right. Where are the vans coming up to my house asking me as a Midwestern guy living 10 miles, 5 miles from a cornfield, middle class, middle age, white guy, my opinion? Why aren't you as curious about Democratic voters in the world as you were about Republican voters in the world? And that's because, Republican voters are interesting and alien to us, but we know all about Democrats. Democrats are, the people we dine with and the people we know, and the people we schmooze. And so it's this complete lack of interest in the country you live in and its state, because you transcend all that. You are above all that, which is, and you know what? Goes before the fall?
A haughty spirit.
Yeah, exactly. So,
yeah. Well, it's and in the case of like those Cletus safaris, as they are sometimes called, there's nothing wrong ipso facto with doing them,
No.
but as long as the other side is being done with it. But and of course they don't do that. But and I will say, like, I think that part of the reason that became a genre of journalism is that for that the DC, New York, Acela corridor
Hmm.
uh, Republicans, not just the media, but like none of them actually knew what the base thought
No,
about stuff.
they didn't.
And so like that's what part of what these Cletus safaris were about, was to say, oh, wait, these people, they actually do not have these dogmas about free trade and cutting the Department of Education and all this
Yeah,
stuff that Barry Goldwater and Ronald Reagan were all
yeah.
about, in a tizzy about. They never heard of it, and they don't even like it if they have heard of it.
No,
And so it was like, to me, it was very shocking that this was basically people whose job for decades was to report on politics. This was them inadvertently saying, "I don't know about what I've been telling you
yes.
about."
I've been telling you about
That's what this was.
I've been telling you about this in declarative sentences for decades,
Yeah.
and I didn't know anything about anything. And what they reported back on was, I wrote a thing, I don't know, a million years ago, it seems like, and I likened it to like dime novels from the frontier days. This is if you ever saw Unforgiven, the Duke of Death, and these are all these lurid fictions from out in the country where wild Indians ride. There's buffaloes, and there's diners full of people with red hats, and it was all this sort of high adventure fiction that was being paid for and subsidized and turned into a genre by media companies who were located in the greater metro sprawl of the East Coast for the entertainment and titillation of their readers, because it was far away in a strange world. And again, inadvertently, they sort of confessed that they had no idea what was going on in this country ever. And again, they never changed their certainty. They simply broadened the dogma under which they operate. So again, under the Bush administration, it was liberals are cranks and crackpots and un-American and terrorist-loving, America-hating scum. And when the Bush administration fell apart, it's like, well, isn't it a shame that both sides are crazy? And that's been the through line for 20 years. And they're not changing anytime soon.
Yeah. Well, and with this whole genre, I mean, it became not just about articles, it became a book by J.D. Vance.
Yes, it sure as hell did, yes. I wonder if Ron Howard
that was J.D. Vance's book.
I wonder if Ron Howard is having second thoughts now about, maybe I shouldn't have done that, because that wasn't a great idea. But it was his entree. He wrote his book, and his book was his entree into the big world of venture capitalism. And he blew that, and that was his entree into politics. So, worked out great for him.
Yeah, and the book, it seems like this was a book that a lot of people bought, but no one read.
Yeah.
Because if you actually did read it, which I have, it is no different in any way from standard issue Republican dogma.
Mm-hmm.
It's basically the thesis of the book, Hillbilly Elegy, is these people that I grew up around are lazy and they're shiftless bums who won't work, and that's why they're poor. So fuck them. Yep. They need to pull their pants up and go to work at Walmart for $3 an hour.
Yes,
that's the thesis of the book.
Yeah, and that's standard issue Republican. Usually, it involves skin color, but yeah, it's standard issue. Those people are lazy, and they're in bad circumstances because of bad morals. If they would just be better people, they would be less poor and disadvantaged. Yeah, here, pass out copies of Atlas Shrugged down at the local. Here, read. I don't know, Weed a Living, or read The Fountainhead. That'll save you. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's. I mean, and there's an irony also, though, is that I think a lot of those attitudes did creep into the Democratic Party, and this is something that I wrote about a little while ago, about with these, as the Republican Party became successively more reactionary through waves such as the Goldwater people, the Reagan people, the Pat Robertson people, the Tea Party people, and then now onto the Trump people, like as these waves of far right freakazoids kept flooding into the Republican Party, some of them started saying, okay, well, I can't take this anymore.
Yeah.
I'm going to go be a Democrat.
Yeah.
But I'm not going to change anything that I believe.
Why would I do that?
And
I'm not the problem. My belief structure is not the problem. Those people are the problem. And okay, that gets you through the night, but that's not my experience. My experience is you created a magnet by your ideology. I don't mean you, but Republicans created an ideology that became a magnet for people who were terrible and who had terrible beliefs and believed terrible things. And the more the party came to depend on pandering to those people, and they didn't do it directly. This was Trump's genius. It used to be done, they used to job it out to someone else. It was someone else's job to go get the base fired up. It was Rick Wilson's job. It was Lee Atwater's
Bill
job.
Buckley.
Bill Buckley. Yeah. Their job was to
Rush
go
Limbaugh.
Yeah. And I mean, there's a whole multi-billion-dollar industry of getting the rubes to the polls, hating the right people at the right moment. Donald Trump just cut out the middleman. He just started talking like Rush Limbaugh talked, and the base loved him. And he did the other thing that was terribly important to them. He absolved them of responsibility for George Bush. He said, you are not responsible for George Bush. George Bush lied you into a war, and he screwed up real bad. And there's his brother right there. You don't want to elect his brother, do you? It's just another goddamn Bush. And the base, at that moment, became magnetized to him. Because what they were seeking the entire time the Tea Party was up, and while they were freaking out about Barack Obama and so on and so forth, was, we don't want to take responsibility for all the shit we just did 8 years ago. We don't want anyone reminding us of the Bush-Cheney signs in our yard. We don't want anybody telling us reminding us we were on the radio screaming about liberals being dirty, America-hating, terrorist-loving scum. We want someone to change the dialogue.
And how the Iraq War was great.
The Iraq War was great.
And it was going perfectly.
It was going perfectly. And I've likened it to Germans after the fall of Berlin burning their uniforms. They didn't want to take responsibility. We were in Switzerland the whole time. We had nothing to do with that. So suddenly you have a brand new party called the Tea Party, who'd never heard of George Bush. And we're independent constitutional conservatives, not Republicans. Why would you call me a Republican? And they were desperate for someone to come along and tell them they weren't responsible for their lives and the decisions they'd made. And liberals kept telling them that they were. And Donald Trump said, you're not responsible for anything. In fact, you're the patriots, and they're the awful people.
You're the victims.
You are absolutely the victims, yes. And you're the victims of those people over there. And I know I've said this before. We tried an 8-year lab experiment of not being offensive and reaching with an open hand and not being judgmental and let's all get this together. And it was called the Obama administration. There's no red states or blue states. There's purple states. And there's a mighty guy.
And the healthcare plan is Mitt Romney's.
Yeah. And they had an 8-year racist primal scream, and then they elected Donald Trump. It's like at that point I'm like, don't you get it? That's the party. This is what they've chosen. This is who they are. Quit trying to pretend they're not this way. And that's where most Never Trumpers and I part company, because they really want to continue to believe that it wasn't their fault, or they had nothing to do with it, or it was just a fluke, or it's just a fever, or sometime we'll be able to reclaim the party. We'll be able to come back to the party.
Or it's just Trump. It was just Trump.
It was just Trump. One bad apple and a couple of guys around him, and once he's gone, everything's fine. That's not true. And after Trump is going to be a whole lot of toxic waste out there that someone's going to want to build a party out of. And it's not going to look a damn thing like the Dwight Eisenhower Republican Party of the 1950s.
Yeah, no, not at all. And but so as that sort of migration of former Republicans into the Democratic Party happened, it did make the Democratic Party more conservative.
It did.
And this wasn't, this is a thing that happened over decades. I mean, Hillary Clinton herself is a former Republican.
She's a Goldwater girl. She was a Goldwater girl.
Yeah, that's right. She was, yeah. And there were other former Republicans who, or if they weren't Republicans, they were it's odd that I don't hear people say enough how neoliberalism is basically just libertarianism. That's what it is. And, and so they flooded into the Democratic Party and, made them not do what needed to be done. And basically, the thing is, though, there were enough of them that Democrats could get just slightly past the 50-yard line. Yep. And instead of doing what they should have done, which is try to activate the, 70 million, 80 million, depending on the election, 70 to 100 million people, adults, who could vote but don't.
Right.
And they never asked them, well, why don't you vote? And like, so to the extent that they did, they would focus on voter registration problems. But the polling is in now, and people who don't vote in elections, they say it's easy to register, and they could if they wanted to.
Solving the wrong problem.
Choose not to. They choose not to.
Now,
because
why do they
the
choose
Democrats
not to?
haven't done it.
Now, why do they choose not to? That's a very interesting question.
Well, and there's multiple reasons, but yeah, like and in a lot of elections, the people what they call and I have an entire episode on this called the unlikely voters. Actually,
plug it. You're a podcaster. Plug that episode. Go right ahead.
Yeah, there we go. But it's there's polling done by David Paleologos, the pollster, and he surveyed these people over the decades, and for many years they preferred the Democratic nominee for president, and so it's because, well, in other words, if they were forced to choose someone,
right,
they would choose the Democrat, but they don't because the Democrats haven't talked to him or are not forceful. Because like going back to the idea of cynicism and complacency,
right.
A lot of people really do think that both parties are the same, and the media, of course, tells them that.
Yeah.
But at the same time, Democrats also are not out there saying, "Hey, we actually are different than those guys, and here's what we're going to do for you." They don't do that. Like they've been so focused on just getting past the 50-yard line.
Yep.
That's all we have to do. And the thing is, you can't do that with this Trumpist fascism.
No.
They have to be crushed. They have to be crushed, and you have to if you say the democracy is at stake, then you actually have to fucking mean it and do something different.
Yes, you do.
Than what you've been doing. And for the longest time, they didn't change anything.
No.
The Democrats.
Well, I think there's a lot of psychology going on there. First is you take big swings, and if you miss, you end up with Donald Trump as dictator for life. So risk-averse Democrats got burned, starting with Reagan. This was, we're losing. My God, we're losing. We keep losing. There was an SNL sketch with Dana Carvey playing George H.W. Bush. And his opponent, it was a debate going, I can't believe I'm losing to this guy. How am I losing to this guy? Well, you did lose. And so they were desperate for some kind of formula to win the White House, not to win the hearts and minds of the American people. And Clinton comes along and says, well, we have this DLC thing. We're going to triangulate everything. We're going to find a sister soldier, and we're going to punch her. We're going to show people that we're centrist and that we can work with the other side of the aisle. And a whole lot of activists I know just threw up their hands and said, what the hell am I doing? I fought to get you elected so you could get back for me the necessary things I need to serve my population. And you're giving half of it away. Your priority is kicking people off welfare, anti-gay legislation, and balancing the budget, all of which he did. So he should be on Republican Mount Rushmore. He gave Republicans everything they asked for, and they fucking impeached him. And, over nonsense. So it took a long time, I think, for Democrats to learn a hard lesson, which was not just, there's a progressive farm movement you could reactivate in this country that goes back 150 years. There are progressives under every rock out there. There are people who think, Medicare for all is a really good idea, and there's a lot of places out there in the world where it works pretty well, or an equivalent. And there's all these polls showing that basically progressive issues are popular with somewhere between 55 and 75% of the population, a working majority. But
including a lot of Republicans.
Yeah,
also,
hell yeah.
actually.
But the only time Democrats have been able to enact those is with supermajorities. Roosevelt and Johnson. That's the only time they've been able to get through lots of progressive stuff that everybody likes, that everybody ended up liking, instead of the Vietnam War, which everybody hated. So Johnson's burning in hell for that. But the Great Society had a lot of good features to it. And the problem is that I think a lot of people feel trapped in this cage of, Well, you need 60 votes in the Senate. We'll never get there. And we have this electoral college, and we have a Supreme Court that's locked down for 30 years. Where do we start? And I think you start with, you got to have a liberal megaphone big enough to reach into the heartland, to activate people, to do the work. Because, and those people have been told for a generation, 2 generations, Matthew, this is a center-right country. This is a center-right country. I don't know if you've heard this. We're a center-right country. Everyone on the editorial board of the New York Times agrees. This is a center-right country. And you know what? Both sides are basically the same. Both sides are the same. I don't know if you know this, but both sides are the same. And the king of doing that, in 2016, is now an MSNBC employee. So Matthew Dowd was the worst offender, absolute worst offender during the 2015-2016 election. He actually fought with me on Twitter. Called my listeners stupid, called me, I didn't like the facts, because I told him, every venue you're in, you're screaming that, Donald Trump is bad, Hillary's just as bad. Donald Trump is bad, Hillary's just as bad. And we have to break the corrupt duopoly. I'm voting third party, I'm voting independent, and you're the ABC News director, man. And you're using your voice to tell people that there's not a dime's worth of difference between Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. And it turned out there was. And what happened to Matthew Dowd? Well, he just went radio silent for a while, and then he appeared on MSNBC going, the problem with the media, it's this whole both sides thing. Man, where did that ever start? Why are people doing that? That is so irresponsible of people. And I go, you know what? The whole thing is screwed. We have a saying on the left that MSNBC is not our friend. So the closest thing we have to a liberal media is like an hour and a half a day in the evening. And that's it. And sometimes it's not that great. So number one, I think, is where you started, which is there's a lot of independent operators on the left doing a lot of things. There's no liberal media. There's no liberal megaphone. And there's no way to reach those people and tell them any different in a massive way without that. And I'm doing my bit with my little tip jar on my blog, but I don't know. I got a lot of great ideas, but so do a lot of people.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting, though, that I do think that it seems like that Kamala Harris's campaign has slowly been reorienting in the correct direction with this stuff. And we can see that both with how, because the interesting thing about comparing the campaign operations of Biden versus Harris is that it's mostly the same people, actually. It's almost entirely the same people, but there is one person who's missing, and that is Anita Dunn, the communications chief, basically, for Biden. And just her absence has done a lot of good, it seems like, because essentially, there's all kinds of smart, creative, funny, interesting people who are over there at Kamala HQ.
Yep.
And now they can do what they want.
They're fast.
Say what they want.
The response,
and they're doing great.
The response they do, the press releases they release, the videos they release, fast, funny, smart, incisive. You're like, oh, okay, you're acting like bloggers now. This is great. I recognize this voice. This is the voice I hear in my head. This is the voice that people out there that I read speak in. It's this quick, authoritative, bring the receipts, take no prisoners, and move on to the next thing approach to politics that, you come at them with a sword in both hands. And, I don't know who said it's all gas, no brakes. And that's terrific. It's a breath of fresh air. And the best thing she's doing, as far as because I'm speaking now for the entire liberal Democratic base, you know that, right? I mean, I speak with authority for 60 million Americans. That the smartest thing she's doing is telling the media to screw off. Because everybody hates them. Everybody thinks, because the minute they get a chance to ask questions, it's like, did you hear what Donald Trump said about you? What do you think about what Donald Trump said about you? I think this is a waste of my time. And why don't you ask me about, policy? Yeah, Donald Trump said this about policy, but he said it in a mean way. What do you think about that? And she's like, that's it. You had your shot, and now we're done. And everyone else saw that and saw, oh, I get it. You're not wasting our time or your time talking to people who are basically working for the high school gossip rag. And it's might have a big gray headline and might be very impressive on the outside, but that's all they care about is that nonsense. It's like, yeah, that's the press corps right now. That's the Washington political press corps right now. So
Yeah.
anyway,
No, and it's driving them nuts
yes.
because, like, so the interview that Harris and Tim Walz did recently with CNN's Dana Bash, which you're kind of referencing there, after it was over, she basically got criticized by a lot of people on both the right wing was saying, oh, you didn't go after her enough or whatever, but then people on the left were saying, well, you just asked her nonsense. And she was like, oh, well, both people are criticizing me, so I must have done something right.
Yeah, that's the Chuck Todd line. That is Chuck Todd's gold standard for I'm doing a good job, is that both sides hate me. No, the right hates you because they have always hated you. And the left hates you because you don't do journalism. You're not interested in journalism.
Yeah. The right hates you because you're not a fascist. Right. So that doesn't mean you're doing a good job. So the Harris campaign has finally figured out that the media, the mainstream press, has a different business model than what they want, and you don't need them.
No,
you can do your own thing. Like that's something that Republicans figured out decades ago.
Yes, 100%.
Decades ago. Now, of course, the next step. So Republicans figured out two things that Democrats missed. One was the mainstream media isn't your friend, and then two is you have to create your own media. They've done both of those things very well.
Third thing.
Oh, you got a third one.
You got to spend money. You got to be willing to dump billions of dollars into all of your operations, into this spider web of think tanks and websites and media platforms and Newsmax, and you have to spawn them, and you have to get your bench trained. You got to bring people up from the dregs all the time and spin them up and let them go and make sure they have money in their pocket. And that's the one thing the Republicans are willing to do is that I used to call the patient capital of fascism. They're willing to spend money over decades to make sure that the media is corroded and destroyed and the fundamentals of democracy are taken out. And we just don't do that at all. And you can tell. And it's still this kind of, well, if we just get a plucky band of rebels together for one more election and we'll knock them down. No. This is the fight of generations. And if you don't spend money and focus way over the horizon, 20 years from now, and I keep watching people making mistakes going, well, once we win, we'll fix it. Like, dude, have you been sleeping the last 20 years? Anyway.
Yeah. Well, and they also think that policy alone is the way to run a campaign, because and not realizing that most people, well, I mean, not saying most, but a huge percentage of people don't know anything about policy.
Absolutely.
And don't want to know anything about policy. They just want to know, what's wrong with this other person. And you know what? And I know that that's a lower standard, perhaps, and not very intellectual. But you know what? They still vote, and you should talk to them. And you should talk to them.
And there's something about that. I mean, I worked for the city of Chicago for 10 years, and worked with a lot of very good people who did a lot of very good work. And they were progressive, and they had great programs, and they helped ex-offenders, and they helped women who were in shelters, and they got people jobs, and we did a whole bunch of cool stuff. But getting them to summarize what they did in English language and tell the rest of the world, here is what we did, and you know what, we're proud of our work, was like pulling freaking teeth. They were just didn't have the mindset of you bake the cake, then you have to sell the cake, and then you take the credit for the cake, which means you get to buy enough ingredients for 2 cakes next time. Isn't that great? They just didn't get it. They just wouldn't talk about themselves in those terms. And I think it's just something wired into a lot of progressives' brains that, the act itself should be enough. The work should speak for itself, and it doesn't. It just doesn't.
Yeah, it doesn't, because most people are just trying to survive in this world.
Yeah.
And, they have to work, 2 or 3 jobs because the state they live in has a, 7.25-hour minimum wage.
Yeah.
And so they don't have time to read your policy paper.
No, they don't.
They're never going to.
That's right.
And they're not going to read your New York Times op-ed. They're not going to read watch a video on your website about how great your policies are. They're never going to go to your
Well,
website.
and good policies,
You have to reach them where they are.
good policies are invisible. When I go to the DMV
Yeah.
here, the DMV here is great, by the way. It works smoothly. It works terrific. They don't make any headlines because they're doing exactly what they should do, and they're doing it very efficiently and well. My post office works great. No one's going to write stories about how well the post office is working. So when public policy
Yeah.
actually does what it's supposed to do, then it's invisible, and that's terrific. But when you get Republicans in office who are trying to break the system, this is something that Republicans really do. I want to get into government to break government to show people government doesn't work. Look, see,
Yeah.
look how terrible FEMA is. Well, yeah, you put a lunatic in charge of it who had no qualifications. Yeah, but FEMA's bad. Government's bad. Government failed you. And you start convincing enough people that government is broken and can never be fixed, and it will always be your enemy, and they're just taking your money, your good hard-earned tax money.
And that's the cynicism.
Yeah.
Yeah. Again.
So, and these are human problems, and there is a solution to them. The solution, however, is boring. It is having your own giant megaphone with hundreds of voices, thousands of voices all over the country, speaking more or less from the same playbook, which is the progressive playbook, and reaching people where they are, and doing what unions used to do. Going into neighborhoods and talking to people where they live, and getting to know them, and getting to, so they're comfortable with your face, like beat cops used to do when I was a kid. You knew who they were, and you knew that they were trustworthy. And if they had an opinion about something, you would listen to it because they're decent guys and they took care of my mom. This is what Chicago aldermen do. You give them a turkey at Thanksgiving and a ham at Christmas, and you'll get their vote next time the polls come up. And it's politics 101, but it requires, sadly, because of a lot of reasons, including Citizens United, a shit ton of money. I'm glad that Kamala Harris raised $370 million in the last 20 minutes. It's insane that elections cost $370 million. Nobody can play on that field other than the very wealthy.
Yeah. Yeah. But you got to do something with that money after you raise it. Like that,
Yep.
to go back to the Organizing for America thing, because that was also a thing with the Howard Dean campaign.
Yep.
They had created Our Revolution based out of his former campaigns, and that also went nowhere,
Mhm.
in large part because people lined their pockets with the money rather than actually doing something with it, I will say.
I keep missing the part where I get my big Soros check. So I'm obviously not sleeping with the right people. Or
Yeah.
something, so
Yeah, but here's the paradox is, though, that because progressive policies are more popular, from a crowdfunding standpoint, there shouldn't be a money problem
No.
for independent media on the left.
Nope.
It's just that the people who are raising that money, they flush it down the mainstream media toilet on
yes,
advertising.
they do.
And then there's nothing to show. Like after the election's over, almost all the money was spent.
Mhm.
And there's no infrastructure that is put in place. There is no, career paths for people to come afterward
Right.
to advocate for the ideas, or even the candidate themselves. Like, you would think that if you win the White House, that you would want to have some people out there that are saying, "Hey, this person's pretty good. You should like what they're doing. Think about voting for him next time." But they don't do that.
You would think so. And one of the things I will put this to bed at the end of this decade. One of the things that just irked that crap out of me, but made me laugh a lot, was that a handful of former Republicans, called the Lincoln Project, popped up out of nowhere and basically repurposed, in my opinion, liberal talking points about the Republican Party in short videos, which is something liberals do and liberals have done. But they had something we never did, which is they had 24-hour-a-day access to the cameras at MSNBC and CNN. They got to be the people who were speaking for the resistance and the revolution. And liberals wrote them a ton of money. They made a shit ton of money writing. And as far as I can tell, they didn't move the needle at all in 2020. They might have, but there's no objective evidence as far as I can tell that they did. What they did do was write a bunch of ads that made liberals all warm and sticky inside. Like, ooh, he's saying Trump's an asshole. That's great. Let's have more of that. And so you had people in Hollywood writing checks to them, big checks that would sustain me for 2 or 3 years, to do more of these ads that were designed to make liberals happy. It was, I called it a Pornhub for liberals. It was cool 20-second, 30-second, half an hour porn that made us happy, but it didn't do anything. It got shown on television, it got free rides all over cable news, and didn't go anywhere. I'm like, you know what? Here's a clever idea. Why don't you take all of that effort and time and money and focus on building something that will be an infrastructure for actual liberal messengers past the end of the campaign? And how about you stab it with at least a couple of people who didn't used to work for Ron DeSantis and Jeb Bush? How about you put a couple of liberals in charge of that, or at least part of the crew? And it bothers me that there is a willingness to spend money over very short bursts of time. We need to spend a lot of money in the 90 days before the election with a lot of ads. And you're willing to spend all kinds of money to do that, but not build the kind of infrastructure that you need to sustain that voice and those messages over the course of 10, 15, 20 years, like the National Review did, like the Weekly Standard did. The Weekly Standard never had, more than 50,000 subscribers, right?
And they never had a huge, staff.
No.
So it couldn't have taken that much money.
No. But they were incredibly influential. And Bill Kristol is still, living off that lunch, still dining out on him in his former editorship there. And it was Rupert Murdoch money. Murdoch showed up on his buying spree and bought a bunch of conservative.
Before he started, he actually paid for it from the beginning. Actually.
He didn't buy that. He built that, but he was willing to spend the money to hire a bunch of people and put him to work messaging at the very high end, the intellectual high end. And there was an understanding that if you're going to take on the evil liberal media, you had to do it at every level. And there's no understanding of that, as far as I can tell, among liberals with deep pockets. There just isn't. So.
Yeah, and then there's another obstacle for progressives versus the right wing, which is that Russia, of course, loves right wing media, and we just saw that this week as we're recording that the Department of Justice indicted 2 Russian nationals who were working for Russia Today, or AKA RT, and they are standing accused of funneling $10 million to a company called Tenet Media, and they paid people again, more generic, ignorant dipshits, right-wing losers, Tim Pool, Benny Johnson, and they did it through this woman named Lauren Chen, who has lately her project has been to rehabilitate and mainstream Nick Fuentes, the Nazi. That's her objective, and that's this is a huge issue as well, because Tim Pool, I don't know if you saw the clip of him saying recently where he said, if somebody was a foreign agent and they wanted to subsidize someone, they could do it just through YouTube advertising and no one would know that it happened.
Yeah, sounds.
And I'll say, just before I'll let you jump in, that when I wrote for Salon a few years ago, this was when the Russians had hacked the Democratic National Committee, and there was plenty of evidence that they had, in the days afterward. But the government released something immediately thereafter, which told absolutely nothing about the allegations, and it was literally just an appendix, mostly of terms of what terms were or who different groups were, and it offered zero evidence. So I wrote a column for Salon saying this thing that they put out was trash, and that was one of the most popular things I ever wrote, because the Russians latched onto my column and they were flooding it on social media.
Way to go, man.
And then on top of that, then they invited me onto RT afterward, after they saw it. And then I showed up on RT and I said, and by the way, the Russians obviously did hack the Democrats, and there's lots of evidence. Microsoft has released this and this and this 5 points. And they were so shocked that I had done this to them. And of course, they never invited me back on their air.
Shocking.
But, I know, shocking, right? But this is a serious issue. There's, if you actually are patriotic
and you care about this country, the reactionary media, these people are anti-American.
Yes.
They hate this country.
Yes.
And they want to destroy it.
Yes.
And that's why Russia likes them.
Yeah. Yeah. Or they're willing to do anything for money, which is, again, a dime's worth of difference. There's no difference between the two.
Yeah.
I forget, it might have been Keith Olbermann talking to Sean Hannity like a million years ago. They were at some dinner together. He tells a story every now and then about how, they pretend to hate each other. They hate each other, and they're opposed to each other, whatever. But when the cameras go off, whatever it was, like I think it was Hannity. Don't quote me on that, but I'm pretty sure it was. He said, "But you know that this is just BS, right? It's just TV. This is just TV. It's just a performance. It doesn't matter. I'm just putting on a costume and doing my thing." And a lot of these people, I swear to God, are just floating from one identity to the next, looking for the next paycheck. And whatever will pay the rent and give them a house in California and give them a vacation home and pay for their mistress, they'll do it. And they don't really care one way or the other. They're incredibly amoral. And there's a big audience out there as long as they stick to the subject. And a friend of ours who's also an OG blogger who goes by the title Batocchio told us, 2004, Team Evil pays really well. And Team Angels doesn't. And it really comes down to that at the end of the day a lot more than anybody wants to believe. And yeah, Russia's willing to dump whatever amount of money. And the thing is, I understand that the FBI has a much longer list of co-conspirators or suspects or suspected people who've been touched by Russian money. They're running to like 2,000 more people. And 800 of them live in the United States or so. So I've been going through my checkbook, and I haven't taken any Russian money recently. So I think you've got an honest face. I assume you're in the clear too. But I have, in my mind, a list of about 6 people who suddenly and drastically took a turn from one perspective to a radically different perspective that I kind of think might be on that list. And I won't speculate, but I'm sure, in my mind at least, one of them might have worked for the Rolling Stone for a while. One of them might have worked for The Intercept for a while, maybe 2, maybe 3.
Oh, hell, you can just say their names. Go ahead, man.
Some of them might be the close personal friend of Ed Snowden, who I haven't heard about in years. I have no idea what Ed Snowden's doing these days, other than he's in, last I heard he was in Mother Russia, living a fairly nice life. So,
yeah.
Well, and that's, and you raise a point that maybe we can kind of wrap on it, which is that, Russia also is very keen on pushing kind of delusional leftism, fan fiction leftism. Right. And that goes nowhere. And because it's so naive and foolish and ignorant, it never goes anywhere, and then eventually collapses into nihilism, which then makes you right wing. Because hope is as much about determination as it is about wanting something better and thinking you could do it.
Absolutely,
it's about, this is how I will do it. And none of these people ever did that. They never had you look at Jimmy Dore or something with his force the vote stuff about Medicare for all, like. That was never going to do anything. It was obviously stupid from the very beginning. But the goal was to make people think that having something better and deserving something better and working toward it is impossible.
Right.
And so therefore, Trump wants to burn it all down too. Maybe he can't be so bad.
Yeah.
That's where it ends up.
Oh, and one of my tests for this is Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders believes in Medicare for all. Bernie Sanders didn't burn it all down. Bernie Sanders went to work in the Senate, and Bernie Sanders endorsed Joe Biden twice and has endorsed Kamala Harris. And now a lot of the people who thought Bernie Sanders was the beginning and the end of all things because he was going to snap his fingers and change the government hate him now because he sold out. And I'm like, wow.
Yeah.
So the conspiracy is so big that it includes who? Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden and Noam Chomsky. They're all in it together. How is that even possible? And AOC. How they just keep getting to people. And because there is this, I forget the introductory sentence, but this slow boring of hard boards. It is a slow grinding process. that takes generations to accomplish anything. And the thing that we have as a legacy is that we have the legacy of all the accomplishments of Roosevelt and Truman and Johnson to look back on and say things can get done and things do get better if you're willing to work for them. But you gotta dig in, man. This is a long, hard fight, and it won't be over. It won't be over until long after you and I are gone. And that is something that is just not appealing to anyone who thinks, well, it's so obvious that this should be this way, and if it's not, there must be a conspiracy to stop it, and why even bother? So burn it all down. And there's a big market for taking those people's money. And if I were less of a person, I would be tempted, because there's a lot of easy money to be made skimming from rubes who believe crazy shit.
Yeah, it is, and Russia will help you out with it anytime you want. Seems that way. So, all right. Well, so let's wrap it up here then. Thanks for being here. Tell people where they can keep up with your stuff.
Oh, lordy. It's such a long list. We have a media empire that's growing every day. You can find me at driftglass.blogspot.com. You can find me at the Twitter X at Mr. Electrico. That's at Mr._Electrico, because the Driftglass title was taken. And I'm a believer in property rights. I don't believe in taking things from people who don't want to give them up. You can
even though you're a communist.
Even though I'm a filthy communist. You can find my wife and I have a podcast called The Professional Left. We do 2 episodes a week. We used to split them up into one on politics on Thursday, every Thursday for the last 14 years, and one called No Fair Remembering Stuff, which is where we provide historical context for things like third-party voting and the history of Chicago politics, things like that are interesting, but they do bear on modern politics, but they give you like, oh, this is how we got here. Oh, this is what happened. And we have a lot of fun doing that. My wife just started a knitting podcast, that's where I'm sitting right now, in the spot where she does her knitting podcast, because she is an awesome superior knitter. She is an editor under Blue Gal at Crooks and Liars. And I'm sure there's 10 other things we do on a bunch of other platforms, but at the moment I'm very tired and getting over a cold, and I'm drunk on coffee and good feelings being on this podcast. I'm just high being here with you there, Matthew.
All right. Well, sounds good, man. I appreciate it. We'll make sure to get everybody to check those out. And I'll have links to them as well. Thanks.
Thank you.
All right. So that is the program for today. I appreciate everybody joining us for the conversation. And you can always get more if you go to theoryofchange.show. You can get the video, audio, and transcript of all the episodes. And my thanks especially to everybody who's a paid subscribing member. You get a little bit extra access to everything. And I thank you very much for your support. And if you can't afford to support at this time, please do give a review over on Apple Podcasts. That's very helpful. Or make sure to subscribe on YouTube as well. I appreciate that very much. And I'll see you next time.